Hajime!
Yes, yes, Legionaries, I am back. I have returned. I have come back with the God's truth. That is MCDP, or rather, part of my series and going into Marine Corps doctrinal publications, and I'll be starting off with planning. Now, MCDP 5 planning is relatively a document that is very general, but it probably provides the best fundament to understanding military planning and action planning in general. There's this false conception amongst individuals that combat is usually this, how do you say, it's almost like a fluid action, almost like soccer, right? So yeah, you can train drills, you can train fluid action, you can understand what tactics happen when or where, but you have to get used to also planning on a situational basis. You have to be used to understanding each other, so supporting elements, higher, lower, what the center of gravity of the enemy is, so surfaces and gaps of the enemy, your own self, so for instance your unit and the unit cohesion and abilities, limitations, capes and limbs, all that good stuff, MLCOA and all that. Now of course, planning differentiates between the tactical, operational, strategic level, and so on. The higher up on the planning ladder you go, or rather the higher up on the war ladder you go, so strategic level, the more detailed and prolific an order can be. In NATO, this order is called OSMIAC, right? The 5-paragraph order. And these things can be huge, absolutely massive. And to be frank with you, I have my my critiques about having orders that are this detailed and this large on a long enough timeline. As the saying goes, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And so I think relatively, if you learn anything from this transmission, Sergeant Barnes here kicking it back, is the primacy or the necessity of using OSMIAC, right? Using the planning process simply so that way you can step through, cognitize, and more fully think through the situation that you're in and incorporate it into your OODA loop. So it's not necessarily a step-by-step guide that you're setting out for coordinating elements. No, it's more about an exercise in giving awareness to yourself and to your team and those around you on what to do in the coming conflict, because everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth, right? Things are going to fall apart, especially your plan. However, if you're giving people a framework, okay, if you give people a framework of understanding, awareness, situational awareness of how the enemy is and what the friendly forces are doing, it allows them to, on their specific level, be delegated a certain level of authority and to act under commander's intent and be able to react to circumstances or take advantage and exploit openings which may come about, X, Y, and Z, etc., etc. I don't want to get too full into it, but this transmission will be a guided reading, and like I said, it will be a guided reading on MCDP 5 planning. Okay? So stand by, Legionaries, stand by. We're going to start here very, very soon. So here we go. And this is MCDP 5, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 5, Planning. I read now. To plan effectively, we must first appreciate the fundamental nature of planning and plans. We must understand the purpose, environment, and characteristics of the process, as well as the object and traits of its product. This understanding will become basis for developing a theory and practical philosophy of planning. So, all right, we already set off the starting blocks here, giving you an understanding of why and what we're about to delve into, right? So it's about establishing a systemic approach to things. So that way we're not learning in a bit-by-bit basis. We're not learning in a heuristic basis. We are rationalizing it and crystallizing the process so that way it is easily transmittable and it is circumspect in its teaching. So I return to the book again. Planning and plans defined. Planning is the art and science of envisioning a desired future and laying out effective ways of bringing it about. It is a preparation process. Here we draw an important distinction between a process, in parentheses, a dynamic system of related activities, and a procedure, a prescribed sequence of steps for accomplishing some specified task. So if you think about it in your head, it's the difference between generally like SOPs, so like I said, a dynamic part. So think soccer, right? You do certain tactics as the situation develops. You don't have the time to sit here and be like, this is what we're going to do, X, Y, and Z. You kind of understand it dynamically. And the latter is a step-by-step process, kind of like IKEA, build it yourself instructions. Okay, continuing. The planning process may often involve the use of procedures to perform certain tasks, but planning overall is too complex and situation dependent to be treated as a routine procedure. Planning is also distinctly a process rather than merely an act, because it involves a number of ongoing, iterative, and interdependent activities. Since situations, or in parentheses, or the information available about them continues to change, we must continue to adapt our plans as time allows. Planning is a process that should build upon itself. Each step should create a new understanding of the situation, which becomes the point of departure for new plans. Planning for a particular action only stops with execution, and even then, adaptation continues during execution. Planning encompasses two basic functions: envisioning a desired future and arranging a configuration of potential actions in time and space that will allow us to realize that future. Planning is thus a way of figuring out how to move from the current state to a more desirable future state, even if it does not allow us to control the transition precisely. So, just to recap here, that last paragraph, when it talks about the two functions, imagine this. The purpose of planning is to make you define what an end state is, and once you're able to crystallize in your mind what you want, you're able to plan backwards from that, right? That's just the basic rules of thumb. Know what you're trying to achieve, plan back from that, okay? So continuing on. Planning involves projecting our thoughts forward in time and space to influence events before they occur rather than merely responding to events as they occur. This means contemplating and evaluating potential decisions and actions in advance. It involves thinking through the consequences of certain potential actions in order to estimate whether they will bring us closer to the desired future. In war, this naturally involves trying to anticipate possible enemy responses to our actions. Planning also involves integrating these individual decisions and actions together into potential sequences and examining the possible implications of these sequences. So, Barney style, what he's saying is this, okay? So, we want to be able to think before we act. So, planning helps catalyze action, right? So if I know what I'm going to do once I get around that corner, no matter what happens, no matter how shocked I may be or scared, no matter how disoriented I might be, my act still happens. The mechanism still happens. And just like the OODA loop, which we've spoken about before, right? Once we observe and orient ourselves in the midst of action, in the midst of execution, we're able to decide and whether we can go on different forks of that plan. So simply having that plan is a good framework from which we can jump off of. If we have no plan and we just go there, big frog foot forward, and just we'll figure it out when we get there and just start shooting off the hip, well, my friend, that's not really a good plan, right? Because ultimately what ends up happening is you don't have a frame of reference for action if you have no, aligning or centerpiece. You have no structure to base your action off of, right? You don't know what would improve the situation or what would make it more deleterious. So continuing to read. We should think of planning as a learning process, a mental preparation which involves our understanding of a situation. In its simplest terms, planning is thinking before doing. Even if the plan is not executed precisely as envisioned, and few ever are, the process should result in a deeper situational awareness which improves future decision making. We should thus think of planning as a learning activity that facilitates the exercise of judgment and not as a merely mechanical procedure. So, exactly as I said before, it's not, the purpose of planning isn't to give you an IKEA freaking build it yourself how-to guide, right? It's not that. What planning is a process for you to sit down and before you act, you think about what you're trying to achieve. You think about what the enemy, first of all, you think about what you're trying to achieve, and then you reason back from that, so you start planning backwards from that, and then you measure that against what the enemy might try to do to impede you or disrupt you or destroy you, and then of course plan accordingly so you can vet to a smaller funnel of possible actions with probable higher victory results than otherwise, and then you act. And of course this plan is likely to fall through. But what will succeed at the end of all that is your ability to have that juxtaposition, that framework. You're able to, given a reference, right? So you're able to get a reference, and with those two data points, you're able to adjust your actions in such a way that you're able to figure out what is better or what is worse. You can do A and B testing, right? So if you're just going in there without a framework, you have nothing to test against. You have no implicit mechanism by which you can be like, okay, this worked, but this didn't work, etc. Does that make sense? So anyway, that finishes the first section here. We're going to transition into the second one, which is talking about the value of planning. And I'm just going to read it through, and we'll discuss it on the other side. Okay? Good to go? The value of planning. Planning keeps us oriented on future objectives, despite the problems and requirements of the present situation. Nearly all military activities can benefit from some kind of planning. This is not the same thing as saying that planning should be done in every situation or that every problem requires a planned solution. The value of planning changes with every situation, with every type of activity, and with every level of an organization. Some situations require extensive planning, and some none at all. We may succeed without planning, and we may fail with it. Planning is based on the belief that by intervening in events in the present, we can bring about a better future. If there were no way to influence the future, if we perceived that the natural course of events would lead to a satisfactory outcome, or if we believed we could achieve the desired results purely by reacting to the situation as it developed, there would be no reason to plan. There may be cases in which these conditions apply, but these cases are few indeed. The mere act of planning is not valuable in itself. Use of a prescribed planning procedure does not guarantee that we will improve our situation. Planning takes on value when done properly, using methods appropriate to the conditions and activities being planned. Done appropriately and well, Planning is an extremely valuable activity which greatly improves performance and is a wise investment of time and effort. Done poorly and inappropriately, planning can be worse than irrelevant and a waste of valuable time and energy. There are several reasons why proper planning is essential. First, planning can be essential to the ability to seize the initiative. In order to seize the initiative, we must be able to anticipate events and act purposefully and effectively before the enemy can. We must be proactive. This normally requires planning. Proper planning puts us in the position to be ready to act when necessary or advantageous and not merely to react to developments. Again, I'll stop right here. This is so important, okay? A lot of people, especially in the political realm, they want to say, oh, we'll figure it out when we get there. We'll burn that bridge when we get there. Ooh. No, it's not how you do it, okay? If you're reacting to the enemy, you're losing. This is why conservatives lose, because all they do is defend, which is to say all they do is react, right? So the best way to make sure that you win in any conflict, whether political, in the military, or otherwise, in business, is to plan, to take offensive action, to plan ahead and maybe think about the defensive actions that we would take. So, for instance, if we're waiting and we're about to get attacked in this certain way, right? Let's have a plan for when that eventuality does happen, or if it does happen, we have a standard operating procedure that will help us meaningfully react and regain the initiative, reattack, counterattack, and crush the enemy, right? So planning is essential. Planning is essential. Planning is essential, okay? Getting back to the book here. Second, planning is essential to reduce the unavoidable time lag between decision and action on the battlefield, especially at higher levels. Acknowledging this time lag is not an excuse for acting sluggishly, but simply a recognition of the reality of war. While some actions can be implemented immediately, others require forethought and preparation. For example, changing direction of attack may be relatively simple and immediate matter at the squad level, but changing the scheme of maneuver of a division to include all its support is a more complicated and time-consuming effort requiring great preparation. Similarly, changing the priority of fires in a division can take considerable time if it is necessary to move artillery units. If we wait until the event materializes to begin to prepare for it, we may not be able to react quickly enough. Proper planning should help us reduce crises by dealing with situations before they reach crisis proportions. In many situations, prompt action requires advanced thought and preparation. Okay? Third, planning is essential when situations reach a certain level of complexity. If a situation is simple enough, we often devise a solution on the spot. When a situation is more complex, consisting of numerous interrelated activities and decisions, we may not be able to keep track of the various possibilities without working systemically through the problem. One of the basic reasons for planning is to come to grips with complexity. In general, the more complex the situation, the more important and involved becomes the planning effort. Finally, planning can be essential in novel situations in which experience is lacking. Part of the fundamental value of planning is that it can serve, at least in part, as a substitute for experience. When we are sufficiently experienced in a situation, we may know intuitively what to expect, what goals are feasible, and what actions to take. In situations in which we lack specific first-hand experience, we may use planning to think through the problem systematically and devise a workable plan or solution. Okay? I think that's pretty self-explanatory, and I would hate to waste any of your legionaries' time. So let's just go ahead and continue into this next section called Categories of Military Planning. I'll read here. Military planning comprises of two broad categories, force planning and operational planning. Force planning is planning associated with the creation and maintenance of military capabilities. It supports preparations for war and involves the planning necessary to recruit, organize, train, educate, equip, and provide military forces. Operation planning is planning for the mobilization, deployment, employment, sustainment, and redeployment of military forces to accomplish assigned missions. At the strategic level, operation planning involves the development of strategic military objectives, strategic concepts, and tasks in support of national security strategy. At the operational level, planning involves developing campaign plans to link the tactical employment of forces with strategic objectives. At the tactical level, planning involves developing objectives, concepts of operations, and tasks for the employment and sustainment of military forces in combat or non-combat military activities at a particular time and place. This publication will focus on operation planning, although the principles discussed apply in general to force planning. Right, so basic understanding. Force planning, think about it, people at TCOM, right? Or people at the Pentagon. They're not necessarily drawing up plans for exactly how this division is going to attack where and when, okay? What they're doing is talking about, okay, let's think strategically what the enemy is trying to do and give a hard number as to what the number of men we need, what kind of formations are we going to form, what kind of training do we need, what kind of buildings do we need, what kind of money do we need funding for, all that kind of good stuff. Think about Force Plan or Force Design 2030, right? The Marine Corps is transitioning to. That's force planning, as opposed to operation planning, which is to do with, campaign or like a not grand strategy, but strategic deployment of forces. Okay, so that's the end of that section right there. Next section. Planning takes many forms. I'm not going to waste your time and read this, but I'll distill down to the core idea that basically plans can basically range over activity and time, right? So activity, time, and space are the dimensions. So the greater the time, space, and dimensions of plans, the more detailed and synchronous these plans can be, right? So you can have many addendums and so on. The more limited in activity, time, and space your plans are, the more limited your planning cycle or preparations need be or can be. So obviously this is probably self-explanatory, but it's important that you understand that. Planning as command and control. Here's a new session. Planning is an essential and significant part of the broader field of command and control. We can even argue that planning constitutes half of command and control, which includes influencing the conduct of current evolutions and planning future evolutions. The responsibility to plan is inherent in command, and planning supports practically every command function. In other words, all commanders are planners. Again, all commanders are planners. I'll say it a third time. All commanders are planners. In fact, the commander is probably the single most important factor in effective planning. The commander disciplines the planning process, that it is sensitive to time, planning horizons, simplicity, and level of detail. The commander also disciplines the product to ensure the output is relevant to the moment and suitable to the subordinate. Okay? Self-explanatory. Since planning is part of command and control, the fundamental object of command and control is also the fundamental object of planning, to recognize what needs to be done in any situation and to ensure that appropriate actions are taken. Planning supports both aspects of command and control. It supports decision-making by helping to develop and evaluate potential courses of action, and it supports execution by identifying and detailing measures needed to implement the chosen course of action. As a rule, the higher the echelon, the greater the role of planning in the command and control effort. Some high-level headquarters perform command and control almost exclusively through planning and issuing plans. Like command and control, planning focuses on solving problems, identifying a problem, the difference between our current situation and the desired outcome, and preparing a tentative configuration of actions intended to achieve that outcome. Thus, all planners are problem solvers. Furthermore, since planning is problem solving, then a plan is a practical scheme for solving a problem or set of problems. The object in planning is not merely to solve the problem in the near term, but to do so in a way that also lays the foundation for long-term success. The problem may be broad and conceptual, involving strategic or tactical issues, or it may be more detailed, involving the allocation or assignment of resources. Not all problem solving, however, requires planning. When the problem is simple, planning may not be necessary. When the problem is more complicated, involving a variety of factors, planning becomes essential. This is even more crucial when the problem is actually a complex set of interrelated problems, the solution to each of which affects all the others. If the situation is complex enough, planning may offer the only opportunity to deal with the complete set of problems as a whole. Command and control can also be viewed as the process of adapting an organization to its surroundings. Planning must therefore support adaptation. There are two basic ways to adapt. The first is to anticipate future requirements and prepare for them prior to execution. Anticipation permits us to adapt in a prepared, concerted way. Given the uncertainty of war, however, we cannot possibly anticipate every action. We must also be able to adapt to situations as they unfold. The second form of adaptation, sometimes called improvisation, simply means taking action that was not initially planned. It requires us to modify our plans in order to deal with unforeseen circumstances. The apparently contradictory quotations by Napoleon at the beginning of this chapter, and I'll read the quotes right now, so just give me a second here. So the first quote: "Nothing succeeds in war except in consequence of a well-prepared plan." And the second quote: "I engage, and after that I see what to do." Reading back from the text. In fact, they are complementary. The real difference between them is time. One occurs sufficiently in advance to allow for preparation, while the other occurs in real time. So, right, one is preparatory, and one happens as events unfold, which is to say, during the execution process. Reading again. Planning supports both types of adaptation. Planning is the primary means by which we anticipate requirements and adapt to them in advance. We can thus think of planning as anticipatory adaptation. Planning also supports adaptation and execution because even when we take unplanned action, we rarely act without any preparation at all. Instead, we adjust from an existing scheme based on a common understanding of the situation and the expected result. Thus, the plan, even if not executed as designed, provides the point of departure for later unplanned action. As I said before, a framework from which we can improvise, we can A/B test, we can pivot from, we can take that other fork in the road. Yeah? Reading again. Finally, we note that since decision-making is central to command and control, planning must contribute to effective decision-making. In this respect, we can also think of planning as anticipatory decision-making, tentative decisions made before the need to act. In this sense, a plan is a system of interrelated decisions subject to revision, and decisions or plans put into effect. Let me read that again. A plan is a system of interrelated decisions subject to revision, and decisions are plans put into effect. So what does that mean? A plan is basically a network. You're laying out the road path, right? You take out your road atlas, let's say, or if you're not old enough to remember what a road atlas is, think about your GPS. Before you plot your coordinate, there are 1,001 choices, right? And then you plot your coordinate, and it'll show you the exact directions, okay? That is what is being referenced here. This is what is called basically taking into account the different circumstances and decisions we can make. Once you get on the road, right, there's an accident, let's say. on the highway, and you got to take an exit. That's called a decision because you're in the midst of execution. Problems arise. Remember, the enemy has a vote. You take a different tack. Good to go? Okay, let's push. The decisions may be broad and conceptual regarding which objectives to pursue or what tactics to adopt, for example, or they may be detailed decisions about resupply rates or the scheduling of aircraft sorties. When decisions are simple or decision makers are highly experienced, planning may not be needed. It is when we face multiple decisions that must be integrated, as is the case in nearly all military evolutions, that planning becomes crucial. The functions of planning and plans. Planning and plans accomplish several key functions. First, plans direct and coordinate action by instructing those within the unit what to do and informing those outside the unit how to cooperate and provide support. Plans are thus a principal means through which the commander exercises command and control. In this respect, plans help allocate scarce resources effectively and efficiently. Directing and coordinating action is perhaps the most obvious function of planning, and in some situations it may be one of the most important functions. However, it is not the only function of planning, and we can run into trouble by emphasizing this function too strongly to neglect of others. Overemphasizing the directing and coordinating of function of planning can lead to micromanagement. Under such conditions, if unexpected events occur which nullify the planned action, subordinates may have difficulty adapting. Yeah, there we go. So it's important to understand that the situation is always dynamic, and if you are over micromanaging, it can lead to circumstances in which commanded units do not know how to act in a certain situation. Probably the best example that comes to mind is the Battle for France 1940. Charles de Gaulle unit up in Belgium isn't able to communicate with center in Paris and ultimately are outmaneuvered by the Wehrmacht because they are delegating on a mission tactics level, so on the man on the ground is making the call and following commander's intent and not having to wait for hire to give them and meat puppet every instruction down the chain of command. So this is good planning, right? Good planning cycle, dynamic planning, dynamic thinking. Second, planning develops a shared situational awareness. The process of planning itself should provide a common understanding of nature and the problem, and so support communication and cooperation. In other words, planning is a way of exploring the situation, even if the understanding of that situation is incomplete or not entirely correct. And most attempts to attain situational awareness will be both. The common understanding provides a basis for unity of effort. In this respect, planning helps commanders both with formulating their intent and in conveying that intent to their subordinates. Planning should help identify both opportunities and threats in advance and allow us to prepare for them. It should help identify centers of gravity and critical vulnerabilities, both friendly and enemy. It should help us avoid preventable mistakes, although we realize that some problems invariably will arise despite our best planning efforts. Third, planning generates expectations about how actions will evolve and how they will affect the desired outcome. As previously mentioned, planning can serve as a partial substitute for experience. Planning can provide perspective and confidence. Planning can help us establish plausible goals, establish what we can reasonably expect to accomplish, identify problem areas, evaluate courses of action, and develop responses to contingencies through reasoning. By helping to generate expectations, planning can help us recognize when an action is failing to accomplish the desired result. Therefore, as I said before, planning provides you a reference, a framework, a way to see if you're succeeding or not. A/B testing, right? Okay, back to the text. Fourth, as we have already identified, planning supports the exercise of initiative. By helping us detect when expectations are not being realized, Planning helps us identify the need to depart from the original plan. The plan provides the point of departure from which to adapt to the unforeseen. By providing a shared situational awareness and a shared expectation, planning helps us to maintain harmony with others while it's adapting the plan and to properly interpret similar departures by others. This function is especially important in highly uncertain and changeable situations. Finally, planning shapes the thinking of planners. Planning can provide a disciplined framework for approaching problems. It provides coordinated and cooperative methods for solving problems in a group setting. The key is to adopt a method that provides helpful structure without restricting judgment and creativity. The experience of developing a plan can be valuable preparatory exercise in itself, regardless of whether the plan is actually implemented. This function is different from the others, but still important, because while all the other functions serve the needs of execution, this function serves the needs of planners. In some situations, different functions will be more important than others. For example, under the pressure of time, a commander may use the plan to focus on directing the actions of subordinates rather than on building shared situational awareness. In some situations, different functions may actually be in conflict. For example, a plan that addresses numerous contingencies may add flexibility in directing the actions of subordinates, but at the expense of initiative, shared awareness, and expectations. The important thing is to recognize the various functions of planning and to understand which functions are most important in any given situation. There's a next section here called types of plans, but I don't want to waste any of your time again. But effectively what it talks about is there are types of plans in the sense that it can go from strategic, operational to tactical level. It can be by MOS, or rather the specific function, so logistic. It can be combat ops. It can be combined. It can be any number of things. But the most important aspect here is the two different, as a delineation between plans and orders, right? So let me just read here the paragraph. A plan is a particular type of directive. In general, directives are the physical product of planning. A directive is any communication by which a commander establishes policies or orders a specific action. There are two basic types of directives: plans and orders. A plan is generally developed well in advance of execution and is not executed until directed or until specified conditions are determined to exist. A plan is based on explicit assumptions about the future. By comparison, an order carries with it the obligation of execution, either immediately or at a specified time. A plan becomes an order when directed for execution. So for you to understand what is the difference between a plan and an order, right? So a plan in effect is I don't know, if you guys play football, you have those tactics that you put on the freaking whiteboard, or you play any sport that has a very specific technique. Well, those are plans, and those plans are given, right? So those plans are practiced beforehand, or they are explained and circulated throughout the team beforehand. However, when that plan is expected to be pulled the trigger on, so if you pull the trigger on a plan, that's when it becomes an order, okay? So plan becomes order during the time of execution. There are two types of combat plans, and I'm reading here. An outline plan or a concept plan is a preliminary plan that outlines the salient features of principles of a course of action prior to the initiation of detailed planning. We use outline or concept plans to evaluate the feasibility of a course of action, to inform higher headquarters of our intentions, and to initiate planning at lower echelons. An operation plan is a plan for a single action or a series of connected actions to be carried out simultaneously or in succession. Okay, so does that make sense? All right, Legionaries, we'll move on. There are several types of combat orders, An operation order is a directive issued by a commander to subordinate commanders for the purpose of effecting the coordinated execution of an operation. An operation order is normally a formal document. A fragmentary order, or frago, is an abbreviated form of an operation order issued as needed that eliminates the need for restating information contained in a basic operation order. Fragmentary orders are less formal than operating orders and are often issued orally. They're the type of directive used most frequently at lower echelons. A warning order is a preliminary notice of an order or action which is to follow. Its purpose is to allow subordinates as much time as possible to prepare for the contemplated action. An executive order is an order to subordinates that directs them to execute existing orders or plans and conveys guidance not provided in earlier instructions. So a warning order is basically like you have your platoon, you're about to start stepping in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, which means you're about to start marching and rucking, right? So you give an order, hey, be aware, 30 minutes, we're going to be marching from this location to that location. Be prepared to move. Okay? And then the execution order is, all right, everyone, get up, get in formation, we're about to step. And then step, right? So that's basically the end of that section right there. And I think we're just going to approach as things get to the end, and I think it's there are 3 more sections, but I think they're all vital, and therefore I'll be including them in this introduction right here. Uncertainty and time. Planning for an unknowable future. As it is with command and control, the defining features of the planning challenge are uncertainty and time. More than anything else, considerations of time and uncertainty dictate our approach to planning. All planning is based on imperfect knowledge and involves assumptions about the future. All planning by definition is future-oriented, and the future by nature is uncertain. No matter how determined we are to be fully prepared for a situation, there are finite limits to our ability to plan for the future. The more certain the future is, the easier it is to plan. Uncertainty increases with the length of the planning horizon and the rate of change in the environment. Planning horizon refers to how far into the future we try to shape events. In order to be of any use, planning must try to anticipate and actively influence the future. By anticipating the future, planning allows us to prepare and coordinate our actions. The farther into the future we can plan, the more time we can allow ourselves to prepare. However, the farther into the future we plan, the wider the range of possibilities and more uncertain our forecast. A fundamental tension thus exists between the desire to plan far into the future in order to facilitate preparation and coordination, and the fact that farther into the future we try to plan, the less certain we can be, and the less relevant our preparations may be. Given the fundamental uncertain nature of war, we must recognize that the object of planning is not to eliminate or minimize uncertainty, but to allow us to dedicate and decide and act effectively in the midst of uncertainty. While all planning contains an element of forecasting, we must recognize that the object of planning is not to predict the future. How accurately a plan forecasts the future is not generally a measure of a plan's effectiveness. Rather, the measure of effectiveness is how effectively planning allows us to adapt to an uncertain future. So basically, a plan is basically formulating a scheme of maneuver or a tactic or an action which will cover as many probabilities as possible. That is the most durable framework possible for addressing any issues that may come up. Does that make sense, Legionary? All right, reading from the text again. Not only is war fundamentally uncertain, it is always changing. Because situations change continuously, plans tend to lose their value over time, and they must be updated as the situation changes. The more frequently and quickly the situation changes, the more often a plan must be revised. Okay, this is self-explanatory, but basically plans always change. The faster tempo of ops happen, the faster these plans will change. The more uncertain a situation is, the faster that one must be able to orient, basically observe, orient, decide, and act, and etc. All right, back to the text. Time becomes a precious commodity that both sides will attempt to exploit. The result is more or less constant pressure to decide and act more quickly than the enemy. We must use available planning time wisely. All planning takes time, and we should realize that it may occur at the expense of tempo. However, this is not necessarily the case. Planning done well in advance of the need to act may actually permit us to act more quickly when the time for action arrives. I really hate how repetitive this text is, by the way. I hope you're tracking how simple it is, which is the design, but they could have done a better job of rewording things so that way it doesn't feel monotonous to read. It shouldn't be monotonous, but for MCDP publicators and editors out there, please make a better effort into making the text more engaging. I understand that you're under certain constrictions because you have to appear to be professional, but effectiveness is professionalism, right? So if it's stupid but it works, it isn't stupid and it's professional. All right. So there's a section here called Planning Misused. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but it's important to give you the pointers, right? To make sure that you're not using plans in this way, so that way you understand what plans are for, right? So first, don't make the attempt to forecast and dictate events too far in the future. So stop thinking like doing 4D chess, 5 moves in the future. You're not going to be able to reasonably and reliably do that. Not only cognitively are you going to be able to conceptualize these kinds of things, what you ultimately do is forget the fact that the enemy has a vote, right? They might do things rationally, they might do things irrationally. They might not even know what they're doing. You don't even know the conditions 5 turns from now. So, be aware. Make sure you're not thinking too far in the future on your plan. Then, a second planning mistake is planning too much in detail. Too much detail can be a problem. I'm sure many of you know this, but getting lost in the weeds is a huge, huge mistake, and I constantly see this, okay? There's a number of people who think that making a whole bunch of details on their plan is somehow going to make the plan better because it makes them look serious. They shuffle the papers really well. No. The point of a plan is to be simple. Simple and easily understood. Third thing. So the tendency to use planning as a scripting process, right? So, which is to say to overly define what it is that friendly forces will do and overly define what the enemy forces are going to do. And this is critical, okay? There is just simply too much chaos in combat to be able to understand fully what even your forces are going to make, let alone that of the enemy. Lastly, the tendency for institutionalized planning methods to lead to inflexible or lockstep thinking, and for planning and plans become rigid and overly emphasized procedures. So let me just take this a step back. The best way to plan and to visualize it in your head is not to give your subordinates a thin line to walk, right? A thin line from A to B. No. The way to think of a plan is to think like a cone, right? Like a blunderbuss, right? So you're saying, okay, here's the general scheme of maneuver. Here are the left and right lateral limits. This is a general idea of what you should be doing or what you could be doing, but you can change it. You can assess as you execute the mission and make those judgment calls as it develops. So it's more of a guideline, right? It's a guideline as opposed to a do or die, by the book, this kind of thing. Because what happens is a plan at that point becomes not just fragile, it becomes brittle. And any deviation, whether on the friendly force or the enemy force, so if the enemy doesn't act in the same way that you thought they would, well, my friend, what happens is that your entire plan falls apart, right? So it's important to think conically, right? Jesus Christ, conically. God damn, I gotta drink some more. No, but anyway, let's conclude the chapter here, and we'll have some final thoughts and sign off. So, conclusion. Planning is an essential part of command and control, helping us to decide and act more effectively. As such, planning is one of the principal tools the commander uses to exercise command and control. Planning involves elements of both art and science, combining analysis and calculation with intuition, inspiration, and creativity. To plan well is to demonstrate imagination and not merely to apply mechanical procedures. Done well, planning is an extremely valuable activity that greatly improves performance and is an effective use of time. Done poorly, it can be worse than irrelevant and a waste of valuable time. The fundamental challenge of planning is to reconcile the tension between the desire for preparation and the need for flexibility and recognition of the uncertainty of war. All right, concluding. So the important thing for you, Legionary, to understand, at least maybe in a real-world example of what not to do. So the Soviet Union was infamous for implementing planning that lockstepped everything down to a timetable with exact units in exact places at an exact certain force structure and combat force scenario. So what I'm trying to say is that the Soviets from top to bottom meat puppeted every single unit at every single echelon at every single time way into the future. Well, thank God for them that the war didn't crack off, right? If it didn't pop off, and let's assume, of course, that nuclear weapons and WMDs didn't exist, and it was just a conventional exchange. Well, what would happen is that they would lose. Why would they lose? Aside from the technological aspect of the technics, aside from all that kind of stuff, well, my friend, when you go to war, the enemy gets a vote. Not only do they get a vote, but they punch you in the mouth. So what's that to say is that ultimately, at some point, we know that some echelon's going to mess up. Some echelon's going to be stopped. Some echelon is going to be rooted by us, right? So it's important for you not to make that exact same mistake, not to think in a very totalitarian meat puppet motion, right? So you can't think that giving orders is about exactly playing like with little dolls, okay? You're not doing that. You're leading men. You're leading wolves. And the best way to think about this is that there are attack dogs, and you're giving them a left and right lateral limit, a general intent, and a rule of thumb, but the latitude within those parameters to act. If you're able to delegate, which is what the Germans really innovated, which is mission type tactics, right? If you're able to delegate that action, you are going to be able to do the most important and salient thing, which is lead well. Because if you're delegating to your subordinates the actions and the thoughts, you are taking off your brain and you're off your person a significant amount of your cognitive load. So this will free you to be at the point of friction. So there will always be within your unit a place that you will be needed as a leader, as a commander, whether it's on a squad level or all the way up to a divisional level. And so the most important aspect with planning is to plan in such a way that is flexible, concise, simple, that it's durable, right? So you're not hinging on everything that's brittle or whatever, and that it empowers / it has actually expectations of your subordinates to act out the commander's intent and use their little noggin to achieve that part of the mission. This way you are freed. Ideally, Patton put it perfectly, ideally what you're going to be doing is kicking back, relaxing, and being at the point of friction. So obviously this doesn't mean that you're too detached and kicking back. I'm being hysterical here. I'm being a little bit over the top. But what I'm trying to tell you is that you can't be micromanaging people. There's this really wrong term that we use that we call it micromanagement, and we think that's a good thing. It's even worse than that. You're meat puppeting people. You're being a tyrant. And not only is it just, I guess, maybe whatever, morally condemnable. I don't care about that, but it's just not effective, and it fails every time. Okay? And this attitude that people have where it's like, oh, I could have done it better than him. I could have done it better than him. Well, my friend, you should look at yourself. That's not a problem of execution. That's a problem of education. And education, that responsibility falls on you. Let your subordinate carry out the orders to whatever extent. Obviously, if it's going way off in left field, go fix that, go adjust that. But in general, a lot of you are way too conscientious to, I need it a certain way. I need it to be this certain way. That it actually impedes the unit cohesion, ability to act, and ultimately what you're doing is you're not training your subordinates in such a way to act autonomously, which is ultimately your responsibility and what the aim of every plan and planner commander should be, that you act autonomously on the commander's intent. But anyway, we'll be going more into depth about planning in general, but this should give you a overall guide as far as the nature and the exact parameters of planning as such. Thank you so much. This is Lance's Legion. This is General Lance and Sergeant Barnes, as always, with Technica, signing off.